Welcome to the Wisconsin Podcast. I'm Greg Sauer. On this podcast, we talk Wisconsin things, everything from media, sports, culture, nature, politics, and more. Today's guest is BJ Hollars, the author of a number of books, including most recently, Flock Together, A Love Affair with Extinct Birds. Hollars is an associate professor of English at the University of Wisconsin-Eau Claire and is the founder and executive director of the Chippewa Valley Writers Guild. Here's our chat. Well, so let's talk about the book a little bit. Why write a book about extinct birds?
Yeah, certainly it wasn't to sell a bunch of books. I think it's a tough topic to write about, to think about. But the truth is, this subject, extinction, had been really weighing on me. I had come across a book of photographs, a coffee table book at a thrift store here in Eau Claire. I think it's called Lost Animals, and truly it's an entire coffee table book of photographs of animals that have gone extinct since the advent of the camera. And so upon kind of leafing through that one night, I realized, why is it that we can preserve on the page what we fail to preserve in real life? And that's something that's really carried me through this whole project. It's just kind of this mind-boggling conclusion that in many instances, we're in control. We're the captain in the ship, as Aldo Leopold said, and we don't have the power, or shouldn't have the power, to dispense at will among the crew, as Leopold said. And so I really thought about that a lot, and I wanted to kind of delve a little deeper and try to put a face on these birds we've lost and keep losing.
And could you explain a little bit about how you went about writing the book and kind of the structure of the book? Because it's kind of a personal experience of you kind of delving into the topic.
Absolutely.
Yeah, talk a little bit about the structure of the book.
Sure. Well, the book is broken into three strands. The first is the story of the ivory-billed woodpecker. So a lot of birders really understand this story, a bird that was thought to have gone extinct around the 1940s and then suddenly reappeared, or we thought it reappeared again in 2004, 2005. So that's the first strand. The second strand is the story of the passenger pigeon. Again, this is a very well-known story. The most abundant bird, or one of the most abundant birds on the planet, that went from billions to none in half a human lifetime. That's the soundbite. That's what I always relay to people. In 40 years, we took the most abundant bird and brought that number to zero. And then the third section is sort of the more personal section. It's my transition from budding birder to slightly less budding birder, kind of under the tutelage of a guy named Steve Betchkall, who, if you'll forgive the pun, took me under his wing, literally, and kind of let me kind of follow along and do some birding expeditions with him, and really kind of taught me the value of getting to know the names and the songs of the birds that are still here.
I felt like the book was kind of like a gateway to, birding in a way, because you're kind of talking about the experience and like growing into it. Can you tell me about some of the little idiosyncrasies of like birders, in the sense that they have like a bird count, Christmas count, and some of the different things that birders do that most people wouldn't, know?
Sure. Well, the birding community, first of all, incredibly welcoming. I was, frankly, pretty nervous about trying to enter this world. I was very intimidated. I was completely out of my league on every front. I can, more often than not, identify the right type of woodpecker outside my window, but that's still only 80% of the time. So I'm not an expert by any means. If it's an extinct bird, I'd have some luck, but the birds that are still here, I'm not great at identification yet. That's just an ongoing process. But the birding community was super helpful, and every time I kind of explained I'm new to this, they would just welcome me with open arms, kind of teach me things along the way, tell me just little tidbits about how to look for birds. One idea that really stands out came from my mentor, Steve, who just said, when you're scanning the horizon line there, just look for blobs. Just look for blobs in the trees. Don't worry about birds. Look for blobs. And if you see a blob, it's probably an eagle or it's probably a hawk. And it's funny how I never thought about how to train my eyes to look differently to find something. And so that's just one example. But yes, birders have all kinds of unique skills and idiosyncrasies. A lot of them have life lists, which are these kind of very in-depth and highly specific lists of birds we've seen at any one time and the number and location. And then all of this information can be used in the aggregate, kind of submitted to this eBird website, and then we can generally have a better sense of migration patterns and the number of birds in any one region at any one time. And so it's really a great example of citizen science, but also has that kind of competitive edge to it. So it's really just been a great way for a lot of birders to find a way to make it about more than just the experience itself. Though frankly, for me, it kind of is just about the experience itself. I almost like that fleeting nature of it. You know, you glance away for a second, you might miss it forever. And so that's kind of where I get my fun in the birding world.
Do you feel more in tune with kind of the world around you when you're out in nature? You know, I think I've experienced this where after kind of like looking for an animal for a while, I've kind of like started to understand like how to listen and how to like just sense things a little bit more. I'm wondering if that's something you've kind of developed too, and that you maybe see more than you used to when you used to go out like hiking or whatever it may be.
Absolutely. And, you know, I didn't even realize just how much my body and my soul and my mind were all really craving that. You know, I didn't know what I was missing until I began to see what I was missing, you know. And so these days it was very clear to me. I walk my dog differently. I don't walk with headphones in my ears. I don't listen to podcasts when I'm outside. I'm there to focus on the outdoors. I'm there to kind of look in the trees, to listen to those songs. And I swear my blood pressure must lower quite a bit. It's almost like my own attempt to kind of, you know, take a deep breath and do a little meditation and get some fresh air and some nature all the same. So, yeah, to answer your question, I mean, I really do view the world differently. And I'm not perfect at it. I mean, some days I'm still listening to the podcast, but I find that it's just more rewarding to take those earbuds off and to take a moment to really focus on this moment in this place and to see what you're surrounded by.
You also read about the concept of the spark bird. I'm wondering if you could explain what that is and what yours was.
Yeah, well, speaking of gateways, the spark bird, is in many ways the gateway bird. It's the bird that really gets budding birders interested in perhaps making it more than just a hobby, or really spending some serious time out in the field with binoculars, field guide. And so my spark bird, it strangely enough was one of the extinct birds. I think it was the ivory-billed woodpecker, simply because I knew it was something I would never, ever see in nature, you know, and that just broke my heart so deeply. You know, it's such an incredible bird, and if you go online, you can still hear a few of the calls that were recorded, and there are some photographs, and there are some sketches, and so there's ways we can come close to knowing that bird, but it's an unorthodox way to get into the world of birding. 99% of folks would pick a bird that you could actually see in your backyard, or perhaps know if you travel to the right spot on the planet, there's a good chance you'd see one, and yet I chose the one that I knew I'd never see again. But I think that was kind of a reflection of my general anxiety and concerns about the environment. And so for me, trying to paint a picture of the bird that none of us will likely ever see again was the best entry point to try to make a case for the importance of taking care of the birds and the environment at large that are still with us.
What about the bird just physically appealed to you? The look of it? Was it the colors of it? The bill of it? I mean, what was it that, you know, excited you about that bird in particular?
You know, that's a great question. All of that, to be sure, it's a very impressive bird. It's called the chief of his tribe in terms of woodpeckers. You know, it has an incredible spirit. It's been told when it was captured by a guy named Alexander Wilson in the 1700s, this thing was chained to a desk and it pecked its way almost free. It pecked the entire room to smithereens pretty much in an effort to fight his way back to freedom. So all of that is appealing to me. But for me, it's also the story. It's how close we came or thought we came to rediscovering a bird that we thought had been gone for 70 years. You know, everyone had kind of come to their senses that this bird was now gone. There's a subspecies of variety in Cuba, of course, certainly until the late 80s. But in terms of ivory-billed woodpecker here in America, we had assumed it was gone. And then I remember being in college and reading the one-inch newsprint article in USA Today that perhaps it had been spotted again, and it was just incredible to me. We call it a Lazarus species. If an animal is thought to have gone away and then suddenly it comes back, it's a Lazarus species. So there's a whole terminology built around this bird, too. We call it the Lord God bird, because that was the phrase that people would allegedly utter when they saw this beautiful creature flying through the air. Just jaws would drop and they would say, Lord God. And I knew I'd never get to do that. I'd never get to see that. And so I think all of that contributed to why I selected that one as my spark bird.
And why did the bird die out? It was man-related, human-related?
Absolutely. The majority or quite a few extinctions are related to habitat loss. And so the story of the ivory-billed woodpecker is so frustrating to me personally because it all came down to a highly specific habitat in the Singer Tract in Louisiana where these few remaining birds lived. And we totally could have made a call that says, let's protect this land, let's protect these birds in the process. And instead, the Chicago Lumber Company, who had been using this tract of land for clear cutting, they had a board meeting, a lot of governors were involved, everyone was pleading with them just to take it easy on this one patch of land. They were going to try to buy back as much as they could. And the board president just said simply, we're going to keep cutting because we're money grubbers. And it just kind of broke my heart, that when these kind of decisions are made behind closed boardroom doors purely for economic purposes, it affects all of us. But the door is closed, and so none of us get that say. I think that's another lesson we can take from the book, too, is, the environment belongs to all of us. And so when I call, congressmen, and on one instance I called about a concern about the Environmental Protection Agency that was allegedly going to be terminated for a time, and one of the aides just told me, well, you're from Wisconsin, so you're not in the congressman's district, so we don't care what you think. Click. And what I wanted to tell him was, clean water and clean air doesn't end at your congressman's district line. This is a right that we all have to be able to breathe clean air and drink clean water. But he refused to hear that point. And I feel like I need to keep telling this story so that everyone who hears this, anyone who reads the book, realizes that's unacceptable. And when it comes to the environment, there's something that needs to be done beyond just politics as usual.
You have a couple young kids at home. And you write about them in the book a little bit. And I'm just kind of wondering if that made you more likely to write this book because of that, the idea of what the environment's going to be for your kids, the birds that your kids are going to be able to see. Was that kind of a part of why you wrote this book?
Absolutely. I think the subjects I write about tend to be about things that scare me, things that keep me up at night. But more and more what those things are just envisioning what the world might be like in the future for them. And so when it comes to the environment, this is a pretty scary time. Famed biologist E.O. Wilson says that the current extinction rate is somewhere between 100 to 1,000 times the normal rate. He says it's the worst spate of species die-off in 65 million years since the time of the dinosaurs. This is on our watch. This is right now. Even if it's only 100 times the normal rate, that's terrifying. But if it's actually 1,000 times the normal rate of extinction, it's easy just to throw up your hands and quit. What's the point? I'm going to recycle this 2-liter, but what's that going to do, But I think for me, when I do take my children out to the woods, mostly what we focus on is what's the name of that bush? What's the name of that tree? What's the name of that bird? And 95% of the time, I don't know myself, but we all kind of get out the books and we figure it out together. And the first rule of all of this, and this is what Steve Betchkal taught me, is that we begin to care about things a lot more when we can put a name to it, and when we can put a sound to it, and when we can smell it or touch it or be close to it. And so what I hope this book does is encourage people to get to know the creatures in their backyard, because perhaps they might care a little more about them, and that way they'll know when they're gone, they'll know what they'll be missing if we don't step in now and try to save them.
I read an essay that you wrote after the last election, which was an open letter to your daughter. And do you often think about your kids reading your books and your writing later on in life? Obviously, they're kind of young and maybe not going to read your books right now, but do you think about them reading your work later on in life?
It's a really good question. And I think in my heart of hearts, I hope, when I'm long gone, one day they'll stumble upon these dusty old books on a shelf somewhere and, now I know Dad in a way I never quite knew him before, or, wow, I didn't realize that we were a part of this journey with him. That would be really cool. Just yesterday and the day before were the anniversaries of my own grandparents' death. So I was thinking, what did they leave behind for me? And thankfully, they left behind all these audio tapes. And it's been so cool to re-listen to these audio tapes of their voices, every 5-10 years, and just see these new connections that have emerged, places that they went to that now I've gone to, just weird little overlaps in the universe, And so, I think I would love to know that one day they might kind of read this stuff, and perhaps I won't mortify them or be too embarrassed by what they read. But nonetheless, I think that's a major motivation for me. I think writers often want to achieve some kind of immortality, hilarious as that sounds. And for me, it's a lot more modest than that. It's just, if I can change a few minds about something, that's worth a lot. And if I can hopefully get the people I care about to care a little more too, then that's definitely a win as well.
Now's probably a good time to kind of give a rundown of some of the previous books that you've written in addition to Flock Together. What else is on your list of books?
Sure. I've written a couple books on civil rights. The first is called 13 Loops, Race, Violence, and the Last Lynching in America. And then I followed that up with another book on civil rights called Opening the Doors, the Desegregation of the University of Alabama, and Fight for Civil Rights in Tuscaloosa. And both of those books were kind of born from my time at the University of Alabama in graduate school. I'm just wrapping up a new book, also on that theme. It's called The Road South, Personal Stories of the Freedom Riders. And so a couple summers back, I jumped in my car and I retraced portions of the original 1961 Freedom Ride route. And along the way, I met with a lot of the original Freedom Riders, Dr. King's former neighbor, and all these incredible figures, and just kind of asking them, where are we today? 55 years after the Freedom Rides, are we any closer? And learning kind of lessons as we went. So that's the one that's coming out next May. I also have an essay collection. This is only a test. I have a collection of stories called Sightings. I have a very strange book about drownings called Dispatches from the Drownings, and a couple of anthologies as well.
Is there a collective tissue, you think, to all of your work? Obviously, civil rights and extinct birds. I mean, that's, it was pretty different. It's pretty varied, but is there, some kind of connection to all of them for you?
I get that question a lot, and I always struggle with it. And just looking at my shelf right now, I realize I left out a book about our relationship with our pets, too, which just throws another tangle into that question. But I guess if there is a through line, it's just things that scare me or things that I'm supremely curious about. I often joke that I think my writing profession is kind of like the best example of a liberal arts education. Like I really just track down one rabbit hole to the next, mostly as a means to get to know people I wouldn't get to know otherwise, and to knock on doors and to pick up the phone and write letters and just really have these incredible interactions with people I've never met, and it's so cool, and that can be reciprocated. Even just this morning as I'm trading some manuscript pages with some folks I interviewed, these are people who never would have thought that, some random guy in Eau Claire, Wisconsin would be reaching out to them, but I am deeply engaged in their stories, and 95% of the time, people are happy to help, and they're more than willing to assist and happy to go on the record and want to be a part of the project too. And so building those relationships, I think that's one major through line of all my work, is it's always about people. Even when it's about extinct birds or about our pets or about drowning, it's always about people, and it's always about how do we make our world a little better.
So is your favorite part of the books that you write, is it what you're talking about, that connection, going out on the road, doing the research? Is that one of your I don't know if that's the favorite part or if the writing is the favorite part, but how important is that part of that process for you, going out, researching, meeting people, being face to face with them if you can? What's that like for you?
Yeah, I think that's a critical component to what I do. Frankly, I'm not the best writer in the world, probably not the best writer in my neighborhood, but what I can really do is I can get in the car, I can talk to people who people haven't talked to before, I can try to give voice to people who haven't shared their stories, I can dig a little deeper in the archives, look places people haven't looked before, and then find a way to make it readable for a general audience. And that's always been like the one shtick I have. I can't string together the perfect line or anything or find a great plot to carry it through a whole novel, but I love that, getting to know a person, putting yourself out there, oftentimes in, some high-stakes situations, everything from, family members of a lynching victim to, the specimen rooms at a museum, as a means to connect with people on a whole different level and in a way that, I would have never imagined myself having that opportunity. And it's just, I joke about this during my presentations, but I think it's true, If you really want people to open up to you, if you want to kind of get behind-the-scenes access to a specimens drawer or a conversation with someone who might not otherwise talk to you, just tell them you're writing a book, It's even better, of course, when you are writing a book, but plenty of people have attempted it, even without the payoff of it, and nonetheless, people support that kind of venture. And so that's often my calling card. I don't walk into a situation and hand them my university card and put on a tie. I knock on a door and I say, this is my name and this is what I'm doing. And 9 times out of 10, they say, have a seat, And that's just been the real wonder of this, is that people people are willing to share their knowledge, and I respect that, and I really do my best to make sure that I continue that story and contribute to that story in a meaningful way.
You brought up the specimen, labs, or I don't know libraries, or that you visited at the Field Museum, and also at a place in Madison at UW Madison. Can you just tell me about coming face and you went to basically see the ivory bill woodpecker? Can you talk to me about just like being in that room, in those kind of rooms, and then also coming face to face with that bird that you had seen in pictures?
Yeah, and this was a huge moment for me. I spent probably a page or two trying to describe it in the book, and when I give my presentation, I actually have a little photograph of me holding the ivory-billed woodpecker. But the photo is strange because I'm kind of like smiling, and it's not like I'm happy by the fact that I'm holding this bird, but when someone's clicking a camera, you think you're supposed to smile, but I always comment on that, how my facial expressions in no way match what I'm feeling inside, which was a very complex emotion. Throughout this book, I would wake up at dawn and I would start playing the ivory-billed woodpecker's call that was recorded, and it's on the internet. So I'd listen to that. I kind of looked through a few pictures of the bird, and then I tried to conjure its spirit back, as strange as that sounds. I tried to find a way to bring it back to life all these years later. And so that moment in the Field Museum, when Josh Engel kind of unlocked the specimen drawer and pulled it wide, showed me all of these extinct birds, and then went further than to hand me a specimen of an ivory-billed woodpecker. I mean, I've described it as an anagnorisis. It was like this moment of great reckoning inside of me where I've spent my whole life kind of my whole last couple of years being in love with this bird, but I'm also mourning this bird that I love. It's a very strange feeling. This is coming from a guy who didn't know, a cardinal from a blue jay like a few years prior, So I was very new to this world, but I'd become very invested in it and in a short amount of time. And so I think having the chance to hold it in my hands, it certainly kind of put a fine point on what we're fighting for with the environmental movement. And I still have the purple gloves that were given to me to hold the bird. I had to wear these purple, latex gloves, and I keep them in my office. And so when students come in and we're talking about research, a lot of times I point to those gloves and I say, you can get really close to your subject. I mean, it can be hard. It can seem impossible. The fact that I'm once holding an extinct bird is proof of that. But if you keep knocking on those doors, eventually someone's going to answer. And that was certainly true of this book.
That's an experience that I think probably a lot of birders would appreciate having. And you said you just got into it a couple of years. You feel lucky to be able to be in those situations and to find yourself in those situations?
Yeah, I do. And I guess what I would say is I think a lot of folks could have the opportunity to do something like that. I think we become conditioned just not asking. We're kind of strange or leery about, calling up a stranger on the phone. But if you can just get over that fear, if you can find a way to have enough confidence to say, hey, I know I'm a stranger, I know I'm, from out of town, but I'm going to drive 5 hours tomorrow. And if you could let me see this bird, that would mean a lot, And I think people, I don't know if they hear the earnestness in my voice or what, but it usually just comes down to one human being helping another human being, and I explain to them, I want to get close to this creature, for spiritual purposes, intellectual purposes, emotional purposes. I want to know what we've lost. And so, in my case, Josh Engel was more than happy to not only let me interview him, but then to kind of meet me during my trip to Chicago to check it out. The original plan, of course, was to go down to Brinkley, Arkansas, to get a kayak, to start going through the bogs and the swamps and find this bird myself. But travel grants only get you so far. And frankly, that story had been done. People had tried that many a time. And I felt like the best chance I had to get close to this bird was to go to the specimen drawers instead.
You're a pretty young guy. I mean, you're in your early 30s, and you've written a lot of books, and edited a lot of books, written a lot of essays. Can you just explain how I think you got like 9 or 10 books on your resume now? I mean, how?
Well, to clarify, none of these are bestsellers, okay? But yeah, for whatever reason, I've been very fortunate to find a way to write pretty much every day and eventually kind of have an end result. And I'm not sure that good luck will make me stick around forever, but certainly over the past, close to a decade now, I've been really fortunate. And I mean, for me, it's the same advice I was getting in graduate school. It's thinking about process over product. And so every day I wake up and I go through the process, and I fight through the words, and I fight through the research, and I fight through the drafts, and I reach out for the interview. And eventually there's a product there, and it's not always readable in that first draft or even the second draft, but with enough time and effort and feedback, it eventually becomes something more. And so I often tell the story of my first book, 13 Loops. It was my graduate thesis to start. And when I think back on that year of my life when I was writing this book, I can't tell you anything about my life other than that I was writing this book. I couldn't tell you what classes I was teaching, what classes I was taking, what TV shows I was watching. I really can't pinpoint a memory other than like me alongside the glow of this computer screen reading old FBI files. I mean, it's an immersive experience, for better or worse. I think things have changed once I became married and had a couple of kids. Certainly, I've been able to, take these parts of my life and kind of slice them up a bit better. But, the life of a writer, it never stops. Even when I'm walking that dog and listen to that bird in the tree next to me, I'm still thinking about that next line. It's a blessing and a curse. I mean, great because you can live your life always thinking about the next story, but also bad because if you're good enough at it, you never know how to turn it off. And so it's been very good for me personally, but there are days when, it'd be nice to be able to sit back and enjoy a movie without having to scrawl a note in the notebook. But, not a bad curse, all things considered.
Is it a little difficult? You said you write about things that scare you in a lot of sense, and you've written about civil rights era, you've written about lynchings, which are very traumatic things. Is it at all hard for you to be so engrossed as you seem to be in a lot of your writing to kind of be face to face with that every day, to be face to face with the things that scare you every day?
Yeah, that's a good question too. Gosh, when you put it like that, it probably sounds a little more heroic than it really is. But to your point, I think I am trying to face at least parts of these fears every day. I think the most recent example, I just had an essay come out a couple of days ago about my visit to Medgar Evers' home. So Medgar Evers was the former field secretary of Mississippi who was assassinated one day by a white gunman in the bushes across the street. And so when I got to visit his home when I was doing my research for the Freedom Writers book, it was just an incredibly powerful experience for me, and as a white guy from the North trying to figure out what's my role in this essay, I'm kind of the white voyeur writing about this African-American man who was assassinated by a guy who shared my skin color, so that's always something I'm thinking about, how to use my skin color as a sword to fight prejudice and discrimination as opposed to something like a shield to hide behind. And so I keep that in mind a lot, and I feel like a lot of that work is probably my quote-unquote most important work, because it's directly about human beings and how we treat one another. I think the Bird Book, too, though, in a very different way, is about how we treat our planet, and by extension, the creatures in it. And that's for our own benefit as well, but it's also for other animals. And so, yeah, it's hard to know. I guess I have a lot of fears, which has probably contributed to the many books, but it's a good way to live a life because it forces me to live with that always directly in front of me, So I think that's probably served me well too.
I'm wondering if just what you think about writing books about the civil rights era in today's world that we're living in. The last couple of years have obviously been quite difficult as far as racial justice for a lot of people, and it's been a topic of conversation almost nonstop for a couple of years now. I'm just kind of curious, what you think of where we're at and trying to write about these things in the current time frame that you are now.
Yeah, and I think this whole Freedom Writers book that I've been working on, it couldn't have come, I suppose, at a more fortuitous time. And my whole journey was all about asking the freedom writers, the guys and gals who in 1961 got on these buses, were bombed, were beaten, spent time in Parchman prison, how they're feeling about things 55 years later, And a lot of them were not terribly optimistic, Some of them, of course, were, and as you come a long way, we've come a long way together, et cetera, et cetera. But there was a lot of things that really disturbed them. And I think one of the best things that's come out of that book project for me is every once in a while, I'll get a freedom writer calling me up on the phone out of the blue, just wanting to talk about current issues and to want to know how I feel about this or that. And of course, I want to know how they feel about this or that too. And it's been so cool to kind of get to know our commonalities, even though we're very different in terms of age, and sometimes skin color and kind of geography and background. We have all the same concerns, and I've kind of been under their mentorship and more or less for a few of these folks, and I've learned a lot. And I think the best example of this was a few months back now. I got a phone call in the middle of my nonfiction senior seminar, and it was Dr. Bernard Lafayette, a major figure in the civil rights movement, a freedom writer, a close confidant to Dr. King. And I'm teaching a class, and I just say, we're gonna talk to this guy for a moment, because when Dr. Bernard Lafayette calls up, you stop everything else. So I talked to him. I explained I was in the class. I put him on speakerphone, and he shared about spending Dr. King's last night with him in the Lorraine Motel working on a press release and what that was like. And I kid you not, that was the best class of the term by far. And it was the class I said the least and had the least to do with it, But I think there's opportunities to rely upon folks who have major stakes in this debate and have done so much in the past to really share that with future generations. And so if those connections can in some way help my students get a better handle on things, then all the hard work of writing it was totally worth it.
In the things I've read about you, the name Ray Bradbury comes up a lot. Could you explain your connection to Bradbury?
Oh man, one of my favorite stories. It's like the one name drop I got, although I just did name drop Dr. Bernard Lafayette. Yeah. But nonetheless, Ray Bradbury is perhaps the best and maybe only literary name drop, and it's because the short version is I wrote an essay about him, and I was in high school that won this major national essay contest. Ray Bradbury called me up on the phone to congratulate me. He'd gotten a copy of this essay, and I was in Indiana. He was in L.A. I was like a junior in high school, and I said, I'm in the area. I'd love to swing by your house and shake your hand. And he said, all right, come on over, click. But of course, the problem was I was like 3,000 miles away in Indiana, so I got in the plane, got in the train, van, all kinds of forms of transportation, and made my way to his house a couple months later. And for the next decade, we corresponded through letters, and I visited him one more time before his passing. And it was just, again, it's like my whole story, I guess, is about the unlikeliness of these connections. Again, why would Ray Bradbury take the time to get to know this high school kid from Indiana? But he truly did. He remembered me. We probably traded 50 or so letters over that period, and always welcomed me into his home anytime I was anywhere even remotely in the area, or if I lied to him and said I was. So yeah, I think that's kind of really helped me take some later chances with the people I interview for the books. If Ray Bradbury would say yes to me, maybe this guy will too.
Was there a piece of his work or themes in his work that you really connected with?
Yeah, Dandelion Wine is a book I just treasure. It's kind of about this Midwestern boy growing up in 1928, and of course that resonated with me, not because I was born or raised in 1928, but because as another Midwestern boy, born decades later, it really just I had this great sweeping nostalgia for the world he described, and the world I never quite knew, trolley cars and ice cream soda fountains and all of these things. And so I think he just helped show me the wonder and the magic with which we can view the world. And then, of course, some of his other books are more political, Fahrenheit 451, for instance. And so I think I admire those attempts, too, to kind of foresee the future and to try to warn us against that particular future. And so I think there's probably more I take from him than just about anyone else, not in terms of writing style, but just in terms of like the phrase I used in that essay I wrote when I was in high school was zest and gusto. There's an essay he wrote about zest and gusto and how those things are so vital to human life. And I guess as a writer, that's something I've really embraced. Every day I get up and I jump to the computer and I just can't wait for the next sentence. And I think that's been integral to any modest success I've had, and that's all thanks to him.
Was his willingness to kind of reach out to you and just talk to you and exchange letters with you at all give you like kind of motivation to get into teaching and to, kind of have relationships like that with young people that kind of he had with you?
I think indirectly. In fact, last summer I was kind of working through an essay just on this exact idea, because I think at the time I wouldn't have thought that. I mean, I wanted to be a teacher for a couple reasons. I was a camp counselor. I loved working with young people. I was a tennis instructor. I loved working with young people, and I loved writing. So I'd love to want to try to teach this to young people. But certainly Bradbury, I think, just buoyed all of that tenfold. He was the guy who, again, I was the last person on the planet who probably was deserving of his attention. He didn't care or question that. He did what was necessary for me to make me kind of continue down that track that was so important to me. And so I certainly wanted to repay that favor and that kindness to as many students as I can. And so even on the days when I'm jam-packed with conferences, when the thought of, another conference is just more than I can handle, I always just take a breath, remember Ray Bradbury, and try to do one more for him, and it's truly a debt that I'll be paying for a long time.
If I were to take one of your classes, is there like a refrain that you constantly go to in your class? Is there like a phrase that I would like go away with like in my head forever? Is there something that what's your advice that you tell your students just over and over again? Is there kind of like one of those big items?
It's funny because if you ask my students, there's one that it should be a meme. It's like they love to poke fun at me about this. I call it the cherry Coke detail, and it's based off of this Tim O'Brien story where he talks about, a character named Tim who leaves and tries to avoid the Vietnam War. Very similar to his own personal story, of course. And he talks about eating a hamburger and ordering a cherry Coke. And I always tell my students, I know this is a story, I know it's fiction, but the fact that he ordered a cherry Coke as opposed to a Coke, that tells me it's true. That tells me there's a level of truth here that he's just not quite saying in this genre, but I know it's all emotionally true to his story. It's a silly thing, but I always tell students to remember the cherry Coke detail. It's by no means the most important thing we learn throughout the term, but that idea of going one step closer to truth, always pushing a little more beyond just the bland or the fill-in-the-blank detail, and really digging into the memory nice and hard until you kind of come out on the other side with something that's almost impossible to argue with, And again, that's a silly thing, but I think it's something that students always seem to remember years later. I suppose the other one, and again, I can't even tell you what the information is, but what I do is on the last day of class for my seniors, I've been doing this for years, I give them an envelope and I say, inside this envelope is a note for me that when you are done with writing, when you hate writing, that's when you open this envelope and you'll read the message inside and you'll be ready to write again the next day. And so it's this very secretive envelope, and it's funny because even now, maybe 6-7 years ago, my first students, every once in a while I'll get an email from them that just says, I opened the envelope and you were right. And it's just so cool to have this one cryptic message. And admittedly, it's not like that amazing of a message, but it's just the right one a young writer needs to hear at that time in his or her life. So that's the other thing I think I'm known for in the classroom, is kind of giving them a safety net long after the class ends.
So are you going to share what that message is, or is it a trade secret?
Well, I'd love to, and if you want to sign up for the class, I will be sure to get you that letter upon your graduation.
Okay, fair enough. Could you tell me a little bit about the Chippewa Valley Writers Guild and kind of what's going on with the writing scene in western Wisconsin?
Sure. Basically, the Chippewa Valley Writers Guild, I started it with some help from some friends and a local Eau Claire Regional Arts Council and the UW Eau Claire Foundation a couple years back now, as a way to kind of bring new opportunities for writers in our region. Our region's super well known for music and all different types of visual arts, but it occurred to me we had a ton of amazing writers too, and we just simply hadn't really organized ourselves in any major way. So the Writers Guild is a way to kind of build community. We've got monthly craft talks. We've got 6 or so residencies throughout the year, 1 in the hotel downtown, and then 5 out in the country in Fall Creek, Wisconsin, at a beautiful lodge with a chef and the writers in residence, and a really cool experience there. So those are some of the highlight things we do. We also have a new partnership with a literary journal in town, very community-based, called Barstow and Grand, named after a couple of our streets here in Eau Claire. And so it's just a way to grow our already thriving community. And just to be honest, it's been so moving to just watch the way this community has just grown so rapidly. It's one of the things I think I'm most proud of, because it hits on the same thing that Bradbury did for me, which was just help me find the community of writers when I needed it, And so being able to pay that on, especially for students who graduate or are kind of floundering, what comes next for me, here's a spot where you can always be welcome and you can always continue to work on your craft. And that's the tricky part of being a young writer, is we give you 4 years of being an undergraduate, and by the time you graduate, you're still only maybe 4 steps into a 10-year process of trying to be a writer. It takes a good decade, I think, to really get good at it, And so a lot of them feel adrift when they get that diploma. They don't have the book out, and it's because you got to keep working at it in the in-between time. And so the Guild's been a way to kind of support those writers in particular.
The other thing I wanted to ask you about was your Snippets podcast. which has been, it's kind of like snippets of like your own life. It's sort of memoir, and probably not that different from your writing, in some sense. Talk to me a little bit about that and why you wanted to kind of try a new medium.
Yeah, I really respect and admire folks who do podcasts, yourself included, and I was really interested in how I could try to preserve this moment in my life in a new way. I could write an essay about growing up, being with my family and my children and my wife and all of that, but there's something about audio. There's something about capturing a voice in a location and then putting it in a place with some music and some nice editing that really lets that story pop. And so my children, they're 5 and 3, they love these podcasts. And so I think I probably do it mostly just for them. But they love being the star of the show. They love being a part of a story through my eyes. They live these experiences. They don't quite know what I'm thinking while we're living them together. And so I think they really enjoy hearing kind of how I curate the memory. And my hope here, again, is kind of like what my grandparents left for me. Hear audio recordings of our life, and maybe you'll grow up and think about these and our experiences together in a new way. Of course, I curate them, so I'm always like a perfect dad, so they'll have that to remember, which may or may not be fact or fiction. But nonetheless, it's just been a fun way to kind of turn some of my research interests inward and not just always focus on the other person for the books. I think the podcast is a good excuse for me to kind of think more about my own life and where I am in it and how to preserve a few memories for the people closest to me.
That makes kind of my other kind of question that I had for you was about letters. You mentioned that you wrote letters to Bradbury, and another part of the Flock Together is some letters from a gentleman that lived in the middle of nowhere, and a biologist in Madison, and their kind of friendship via letters. And I'm just kind of curious, when you think you're a millennial, basically, and when you think about the things that are going to be preserved from our current time, and how are people going to write books about what we're doing now in our lives? Does that make sense? How are our lives going to be archived for future writers? How do you see that happening?
It's scary to think about, especially as a professor, because I'm teaching my students research skills for how I research from the people who've come before and even current folks. But yeah, 100 years from now, are we going to be like scrolling through people's Facebook feeds to see what they did on particular days and then right through those feeds, through those tweets? I mean, what's it going to look like? Of course, all of that is so highly curated too. There's nothing even remotely close to a true story on social media. It's always a version of ourselves. And so I wonder if all of this information is actually going to set us back in some ways. I feel like there's nothing better than a personal journal or personal letters to get to the heart of a person. I'm really hesitant to try to imagine what those future books and projects might look like, as people look back on our time. Having said that, there might be some great opportunities there, and nothing is more exciting to me than when I do stumble upon like an audio tape or a letter to somebody's son or daughter or grandparent, and just kind of really getting those personal takes, So who's to say for sure? But certainly they'll be working with probably a lot more information, but I wouldn't necessarily think it would be more accurate, honestly.
Anything else that we should talk about? Anything that I didn't ask you that I should have asked?
Well, I guess I'll briefly mention the new project, just because it kind of plays into my fears a little bit. And again, this is another example of the liberal arts writer in me, because it is so far off of what most of my books are. It's kind of crazy. But it's tentatively called Midwestern Strange, and it's me essentially looking at 9 cases of very strange phenomena that have occurred in the Midwest. And I'm kind of, again, getting in the car, driving to these locations, talking to firsthand witnesses and experts in the field to get to the bottom of some of these stories, not necessarily as a means to solve the mysteries per se, but just because I want to get to know the people who spend so much of their lives trying to solve these mysteries, or at least get a better handle on them. And so everything from Rhinelander, Wisconsin's Hodag legend to Elkhorn, Wisconsin's The Beast of Bray Road to a giant turtle in Cherubusco, Indiana, to some UFO sightings. The list goes on. But what I found in all of this, again, is that there are really personal stories tied up in these strange phenomena. And if you look deep enough and you look through enough of the material, there's these cool threads that begin to emerge. So this book was kind of born out of my fear of fake news and why do we believe what we believe, and that kind of transitioned to strange phenomena, and again, why we believe these things or don't. So it's been a good way to kind of fact check my own take on facts and kind of trying to be open-minded without being a little too open-minded. So that's kind of been my current adventure, and it's taken me to some weird places to be sure, but a lot of fun along the way.
Make sure to check out BJ Hollars' book, Flock Together, A Love Affair with Extinct Birds. It was a fun and very approachable read. As you could tell, he's a very pleasant and interesting person to talk to. I really appreciated his comments about having the audacity to reach out to people you want to interview or talk to. It's what I do for this podcast all the time. Don't forget to subscribe to the podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, and Google Play. You can also stay in the loop about the podcast by visiting wispod.com and following the show on Twitter at wispodcast and on Facebook at the Wisconsin Podcast. Cheers.